Hello, everyone. In the preceding tutorials, we talked about questionnaire-based surveys and interviewing as specific research methods. Now, in this tutorial, we are covering the next method, observations, in a bit more detail. Again, there is no time to cover every aspect and detail and complication of this method. So what I'm doing is I'm taking you through how this method should be understood when you plan a research project and write your research proposal. For a research proposal, you need to be able to describe the specific method selected for data collection and motivate its suitability. Identify and describe the population and outline the sampling strategy proposed. Describe the data collection process as well as the data analysis process. So this is what we cover in this tutorial. I will start by giving you some of the basics of observation as a data collection method, what it is, in which circumstances it's used, or what issues it's usually studied this way, as well as the kind of things that could be observed. Then we will talk quickly about the different levels of involvement of a researcher when collecting data through observation and the different levels of concealment of the observation process. We will talk about population and sampling for this method and cover instrumentation, data collection, and analysis in the last place. Let's start with the basics. Observation is about watching people, their behaviors, their interactions, all of this in a setting where the interactions and behaviors naturally occur. Some of the specific settings you can imagine in which people's behaviors and interactions occur is like people's places of work, like organizations, their home life, their everyday social lives, or their everyday economic lives, like shopping and so on, or during specific life events, like during festivals, during political rallies, during community meetings, and so on. Of course, settings are not only real-life settings, like physical settings, they can also be online, like online social networks or online support groups or virtual worlds or streaming communities and so on. Those are also settings in which human interactions and behaviors occur. Observing basically is about seeing something for yourself, seeing what people actually do, how they actually act, what they actually say, and so on. And it's specifically suitable for specific types of research inquiries. For example, if you were to ask, like in an interview or in a questionnaire, a survey questionnaire, people about their own behavior or the behavior of others, you will only get their version of the story, their view, their idea of what it is they do, when, where, how, and what they say and how they react. But if you can see those behaviors, responses, interactions, and so on for yourself by actually observing it while it happens, you can get a much better understanding of it. So some aspects of social life that can be studied through observation, like some of the more obvious ones or regular ones, include when you want to understand exterior physical signs like clothing, expressive movements of the body, language, human behaviors and practices, certain lifestyles, specific encounters and interactions between people, social, personal, and professional relationships between people, the functioning of groups like organizations, communities, subcultures, teams, families, and so on. The performance of social and professional roles, like how people behave in certain positions. Observation can be, just like interviewing, a quantitative method, and such observations are sometimes called systematic or standardized observations. And they are meant to measure specific variables by using checklists and counts and specific systems of categories. For instance, like if you are observing a post office and you are counting the number of clients, the time each client spends in the post office, how long each person waits in the queue before they're helped, and so on. That is a kind of structured or systematic standardized observation study, but a quantitative way of thinking about it. However, For our discipline, observations are most often used qualitatively and sometimes even form part of a bigger design of research called ethnographic research. We'll talk about that in more detail in tutorial 7. In ethnographic research, we use the term field work or field research. Now, in its original meaning, the field research refers to the collection of data by going into the field, into a community, for instance. And field research can include a mixture of specific methods that usually includes observations, but also can have things like interviews and document analysis. When you are using an ethnographic design for your organizational study, you could refer to your methods as fieldwork. But you can also use observations as part of another kind of design, let's say a qualitative study using multiple methods. You can use observations together with interviews without it being fieldwork or without it being an ethnographic study necessarily. Then it's better to refer to the method as observation and not refer to your data collection methods as fieldwork or field research. Another important aspect is that the researcher or the observer can be more or less involved in the activities and interactions under observation. And the observations can be either known or not known by those being observed. I want to highlight 3 different categories here to demonstrate the different levels of involvement and different levels of concealment that we get in observation research. Firstly is onlooker observation, also known as complete observer observation. For this type of observation, there is no participation, no interaction between the researcher and those being observed. Think about like watching people in a shopping center. This type of observation is usually done covertly. Covert observation means that the observation is concealed. It's not known by those being observed. The researcher is hidden and the devices or notes taken during observation is also hidden. There are certain advantages to this type of observation if people are unaware that they're being observed. And when there is no interaction between the researcher and those being observed, their behavior will be completely natural and not influenced by the interactions or by the knowledge of the presence of the researcher. If you think about observing people's behavior as consumers in a shopping center, you can observe them without them knowing, and then they will go about their business as per normal. But there are also some disadvantages. When there's no participation and when observation is hidden or covert, the data yielded is sometimes limited in its usefulness, because you cannot get close enough to the participants to hear everything they say, for instance. Maybe you can't get access to all the spaces you would ideally like access to. For example, you can see people walking in a shopping center and observe their behaviors and interactions, but you won't be able to hear the conversations going on. Or maybe 2 people enter a shop and you cannot follow them because you still have a bigger observation going on. So you cannot see what happens inside of that shop. Next, there is partial participation. Here, the researcher or observer is somewhat involved, but not immersed in the research setting. There are 2 main types of partial participation. We call these observer as participant and participant as observer observations. Let's use an example of a researcher wanting to observe how a specific work team works together to explain partial participation. The first type, called observer as participant, here the word observer is placed first because the researcher is firstly an observer and to a lesser extent a participant in the group. So the observer interacts with the group but is not a group member. If we use the example of the work team, an observer as participant could be something like a UNISA student doing a research project and then being invited into the meeting rooms where this specific work team meets. The student is introduced to everybody, the research is introduced, and then the observer can also interact and can ask questions and things like that, but they are not really a member of that work team. They are on the side doing their research. The second type, called participant as observer, here it is the other way around. The word participant is first. So the researcher is a member of the group and are observing them. In the example of the work team, the observer can be an employee of the same organization maybe, or even the manager of that work team. And then they are also doing the observation as part of a research project. So they are part of the group, but they are not completely part of the interactions during the observation period, because then they are busy with the observation. So they are kind of on the sideline during the time of the observation, but they are also in some way part of the group. Usually partial participation is overt, meaning people know of the presence of the researcher, and they know to what extent the researcher is part of the group or is an outsider to the group. It could also be that some aspects of the observation is overt and other aspects covert. Maybe the other members of the work team can know that the UNISA student or the manager is there to observe, but they might not be informed exactly what is being observed. What makes partial participation valuable is that the researcher can get better access to the group and get up close and personal. Sometimes partial participation is also difficult, especially if the researcher is not a team member. Maybe team members will not accept or be friendly towards a UNISA student doing such a project, or maybe they don't reveal things about themselves, or they don't want to reveal things about their teamwork in the presence of a researcher. Another danger is what we call the Hawthorne effect. The Hawthorne effect is when people change their behavior because they know they are being observed. For example, the work team might be better behaved towards each other or follow procedures better when they know they are being observed. And that is why also it's sometimes good that the group is only partially informed about what is being observed. So then the Hawthorne effect could be a bit lessened. The third type of observation research is what we call full participation observation, or complete participant observation. This type of observation is when the observer is completely integrated into the group. This happens when there is a long-term integration of the researcher into the group, or when the researcher is already a member of the group. And then also this type of observation is when the researcher or observer fully participates in the activities and experiences of the group and not sitting somewhat to the side, taking notes, as we see in partial participation. Complete participation observation can be both overt or covert. For example, some issues cannot easily be studied overtly, like illegal activities or violent or abusive type of behaviors is difficult to study overtly, and it would therefore be sensible to do covert observation in such cases. In other instances, like when the researcher is a staff member of a work team under observation, the observation could be overt. Of course, if the observation is overt, there is the danger of the Hawthorne effect, like we discussed earlier. This type of observations are good because they lead to the biggest understanding of the behavior under observation. It allows the researcher to see the same realities as the group being observed, and they get to see what happens in the context in which it happens. And on the negative side, especially in covert studies, there are some moral dilemmas with full participation observation. Like if an observer is observing illegal or problematic behaviors, they often have to make difficult decisions in terms of what is the right thing to do in these circumstances. Do I keep silent and go on with the observation for the purposes of research, or do I intervene or report to stop a certain problematic behavior that I find morally my moral duty, for instance? Next up is population and sampling. Now, describing the population and sampling are not straightforward or easy in the case of observations. This is because the sampling units can be a combination of individual people, groups of people, organization, or social artifacts like events, interactions, behaviors, and so on. Instead of describing the population and sampling strategy like we do for other methods, it's easier sometimes to describe the different sampling units. We can do this by covering the following 4 things. The first is the setting, the actors, the artifacts, and the time. Let's cover those one by one. The setting. Now, in order to collect data by observation, you need to select an appropriate field site. The study site must enable your research and must be practically accessible to you. This site can be a physical or a virtual location that has some relevant cultural or social significance for the group of people that are important to your study. A physical site like a town or a settlement, maybe a club, a specific street area, that setting has various features, like there's buildings, walkways, counters, and so on. A virtual site like a website or a social media page or another online immersive environment like multiplayer games, there's also various features to navigate through. In organizational communication studies, the specific organization can be seen as the study site. In your research proposal, you need to describe the geographical or online location, describe the characteristics or the nature of the group or the community or the organization in question. You also need to specify and motivate how the site was selected. Your selection of the site can be done by referring to a sampling strategy like the purpose of sampling, like chosen for your purposes, convenience sampling, chosen in terms of availability or accessibility, or you could select a setting by means of typical or atypical case sampling. Now, typical case sampling is like choosing a generally good, kind of representative example of such a setting. So choosing an organization because it's a good example of a typical organization. Or atypical case sampling, you choose a specific setting because it's unique in some ways, like choosing a specific organization because it's the only organization in South Africa that does this, that, and the following. That is typical or atypical case sampling. For observational purposes, it's also important to identify and describe the actors, the people, persons that are present at the study site. Some people can be seen as key informants, leaders or main figures in this specific social environment. For onlooker observers, identifying key actors is useful because they can focus some of their attention on the behaviors and interactions of those key actors. For participant observers, these key actors are ideal for the researcher to interact with or to build relationships with. In your research proposal, you can shortly describe the persons involved and identify some key role players if possible. If you are sampling people for your observations, you can also identify the sampling method you used, like purpose of sampling chosen for specific reasons, or maximum variation sampling, like ensuring that there is a wide range of different people that are included in your observations, or whichever sampling method you believe is appropriate. Then artifacts can include interactions, events, and activities, among other things. But for observational purposes, it's necessary to understand some of the activities and events relevant to your study. These can be routine events or special events, or even crisis and emergency events. It's useful for researchers to identify some activities and events because observing during these events can give the researcher deeper insight into how people behave and interact. For your research proposal, you can describe these specific interactive situations, events, or specific activities relevant to your research. If you are selecting specific events, activities, or situations for observational purposes, you should also describe how you will go about this sampling. For example, if you choose a specific event because it's incidentally taking place while you are collecting data, you can call it convenience sampling. If you choose an event because you expect certain richness or insight to come from that specific event, you can call it purposive sampling, and so on. Then in the last place, because time and the passing of time intersects with sites, events, activities, and people in observational research, and it is very relevant to observational studies to understand how and why things happen in a certain sequence, in a certain way. In your proposal, you can state the period of time planned to spend on observations and, if relevant, mention specific time aspects that are pertinent to your study. For example, a sequence of events during interaction, the times and dates of certain events, and so on. Let's talk about instrumentation next. Now, most scholars who write about observation research say that the researcher themselves are the measuring instrument or the data collection instrument. But it's also important that you use some tool, some form of measuring instrument or tool to record what you have observed. And we differentiate or specify two of these tools. One is the observation guide or schedule, and the second is field notes. Now, depending on the specific nature of your observations, you will need to plan for the development of an observation schedule or an observation guide. You develop topics or themes that are core to answering your research questions to ensure that you focus on the most relevant aspects of what is happening before you in an observation situation. For quantitative or structured observations, we use an observation schedule with checklists and specific categories and scales, and then space for you to indicate frequencies of behaviors. Such a standardized observation schedule is pre-structured, and the variables and categories are specific. For standardized observations, the schedule is designed much the same way as that we design a survey questionnaire, by conceptualizing and operationalizing concepts from literature, and quantitative observation schedules look a little bit like quantitative coding protocols we use for quantitative content analysis. We want to end up with specific variables in specific categories that must be measured. The observation schedule can be whatever works for the researcher and the study, and here are some examples of what this could look like. You can create a tally sheet with a document a tally sheet document with the variables of the study listed and space to make a tick or a mark every time this variable is observed. This works well for when you want frequencies of certain communicative actions. For example, the example here is about a meeting where the chairperson's behavior is observed and ticks are made for certain communicative actions in the chairperson's behavior. Here is another example. Here the constructs and concepts are described in the left-hand column, and then a rating scale is indicated. In this study, the level of competence of teachers are observed, and the observer will award a certain rating on the scale given as the behavior of competence is observed. And here is a last example. On this example, the constructs on the first column, the concepts in the next. This is for the observation of teacher behavior during each of the 15 minutes of the lesson. So there is a column for each minute, and then the observer ticks off the behavior they observe for each single minute. Now, for ethnographic style observations, the qualitative observations, an observation guide is created much like the questions for partially structured interviews are made. From your research questions, your theory and literature, you identify key concepts, and those key concepts are noted in your guide so that you can link observations of conversations, behaviors, and so on to those main themes of your study. In the end, the observation guide for qualitative observations can look a little bit like a coding sheet for qualitative content analysis. Here is an example. You can see how open this guide is. There is a lot of space for notes and comments from the observer, and the general themes or categories are very broad. For this study, the observer completes information on key events, the setting, the activities, the people observed, and there is also space for reflective notes and comments. Here is another example. Again, the observation guide leaves a lot of space for interpretation and notes by the observer. Here, the researcher is observing the behavior of people while they travel in a train. The main categories of behaviors are on the left-hand side, and then observations are made during 3 phases of travel. Firstly, the waiting period, and then in the case of delays, and then during boarding. Here is a last example. This example is a bit more descriptive. The behaviors that are observed are described in full sentences in the first column, and then the observer can indicate whether they observed this behavior or not by making notes relating to their observations in the other columns. The second important tool is field notes. For studies that use observation as a method of data collection, taking detailed field notes is an important part of the process, and these notes are also a tool or an instrument of data collection. If possible, you can take scratch notes during observation, like these are short, hastily written notes made sometimes secretly in an improvised kind of privacy, like going to a car or to a bathroom or stepping out of a room quickly. This is now in the case of covert observation. If your observation is overt, you might not need to make these notes in private, but if you are observing covertly, your note-taking should be covert and hidden as well. Sometimes making physical notes is impossible in certain situations. Then you have to rely on keeping those notes in your head. Whether you use scratch notes or not, you must make detailed field notes throughout the observation period. You need to transform your scratch notes into more detailed record of what you observed. Field notes contain descriptions of what you observed, details of the site, situation, location, the people, their behaviors, their interactions, as well as your interpretations, reflections, emotions, or insights based on those observations. These notes will expand as you go on, and you should specifically reflect and interpret on those aspects relevant to your research questions. In your research proposal, you need to indicate whether you will use an observation guide and how this guide will be approached, and how you will handle the taking of field notes. For a research proposal, you cannot provide all the details of data collection because the project is still to happen in the future. However, you must show a basic understanding of the process. For observations, there are some important things to remember. The first is get access to the study site and permission. Now, public spaces are easier to access, but closed groups or places like organizations are restricted, and you might need specific permission to do the research. Permission and ethics are complicated when it comes to covert observations, and you might need to get permission, say from a manager, while the rest of the staff of an organization is unaware of your presence. For some covert studies, it's not possible to get permission. For instance, if the study is about hidden behaviors or illegal activities. For covert observations and other forms too, it is an accepted practice to inform participants only after the data collection period, to get their consent and to talk about ethical issues such as privacy, confidentiality, and anonymity afterwards. You must remember also that a pilot test is necessary to see how your observation guide is working, how note-taking feels, and how it practically works for you in the field. You have to get to know the setting and the people. This is applicable for participant type of observations mostly, but the researcher needs to establish a rapport and relations with participants so that they are more open and willing to share. You must immerse yourself as well as possible. Do what you need to do to fit in, to conform, to participate, so that you can experience the everyday things, events, and so on of the way that life goes in that group. You have to keep systematic record and continuously reflect. Observational data can end up to be an enormous volume, and you need to ensure that you keep systematic record from the start and continuously throughout the process. Also, regularly check yourself for your personal biases and preconceived feelings and perceptions, and how maybe friendships and other relationships formed during the observation might have influenced the research process. You have to also think about the debrief, especially relevant in the case of covert observations. In addition to obtaining consent and giving information to participants, a debriefing is also about the responsibility of the researcher towards the participants. It creates an opportunity to talk about friendships formed, sensitive information, emotions shared, and possible negative effects of the research on participants to establish trust between the researcher and the participants. Debriefing is not possible when revealing that observations could endanger the researcher, for instance, in the case where it's illegal or problematic behavior that was observed. Now, for your proposal, in short, you have to illustrate your understanding of an observation process. You must touch on pre-testing or pilot testing. You must touch on familiarity with the people and the settings, how you're going to immerse yourself, how record keeping is going to be approached, and how ethical issues are going to be handled. You should also shortly outline the practical decisions and plans for the process, like getting access and permission, the duration of observations and the planned date range, and the specific requirements for ethical clearance. In the last place, let's talk about data analysis. There are plenty of ways you could analyze qualitative data, and the specific analysis method will depend on the nature of your study. Basically, we analyze data to search for common trends, categorize information, and create a coherent account of the data. Data from observations are usually textual in the form of field notes and completed observation schedules and notes on observation schedules. But it could also include visual and audio-visual data in the form of pictures and videos and so on. You need to briefly describe in your proposal how the data will be transformed and organized so that systematic analysis can be done. You also need to demonstrate that you grasp the basic processes of qualitative data analysis and identify and motivate the specific methods of qualitative analysis you propose for your study. The most basic form of qualitative data analysis is qualitative content analysis or thematic analysis. This is often used in organizational studies. There is also discourse analysis, semiotic analysis, and a variety of other more specialized forms of qualitative analysis. Depending on the specifics of your study, you should choose your analysis method and shortly motivate it in your proposal. Most qualitative analysis processes have the same basic steps. They are just focused on different aspects of the data. Whichever method you choose, you can mention the following basic steps in the analysis process. The preparation of data, how you plan to prepare your raw data for analysis. The generation of initial codes. Many organizational studies make use of some form of deductive coding process initially, getting codes from theory and literature. These are, in other words, pre-coded. Then coding and categorization. After the initial pre-coded themes are created, further codes will emerge from the data. This is an inductive process while you are analyzing, and both the pre and post-coded themes need to be categorized so that the researcher can start seeing relationships between themes and patterns in the data. The general process of data analysis is iterative. The analysis process is iterative because it moves back and forth between analysis and interpretation all the time. you need to show that you understand this process in broad terms. The analysis process is also about subjectivity. It's contextually relevant and deeper meanings are important. A qualitative analysis includes looking at the interplay between the data and the bigger picture or the bigger context of the work. And a qualitative researcher is searching for more than just superficial information. The reason for qualitative analysis is to uncover and understand deeper meanings. Now that is it for observational data collection. This is the second last tutorial in the short series. The last one is on content analysis. Again, be aware that many more details about observations and many different ways of doing observations exist. I just want you to have some kind of background on this method so that you consider it when you are planning a research process or writing a research proposal. Okay, goodbye until we talk again.